A few weeks ago, I was drawing some furniture designs on my computer, as I often do, when my 6-year-old son wandered over and decided that he wanted to draw a piece too. So I set him up with a pencil and paper, and this is what he came up with. Seeing it made me think about those drawings where a professional artist fancies up a kid's drawing of monsters, or I remember another one where a guy made renderings off of bikes that people drew from memory. And, well, I thought it would be fun to try to take his drawing and translate it into a real-world piece of furniture. So, let's do it. Now, the trick with this build is that I didn't want to just do a really quick and bad job of building it. Even though in the end it has to look kind of weird and messed up, it has to look like it was done on purpose. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly what qualities will make it look purposeful, but I think it's just one of those things where you'll know it when you see it. So all of that is to say, my idea was to build it really nice and square, similar to how I would build any piece of furniture. And then after it's together, just go back and remove material to achieve that messed up or drawn look. After I'd broken all my pieces down into more manageable sized chunks, I used my joiner to put one clean square edge on my boards. And then from there I could use my table saw to rip all of my boards to about 7¼ inches wide. The next step was to glue up a few things. First, I needed a bunch of panels that'll make up the various pieces of the cabinet, and then next I needed a few big chunky leg blanks. And actually, let's go over the design so that you'll have a better idea of what I'm talking about moving forward. So the cabinet's going to consist of a top, bottom, and 2 sides, along with a vertical partition, a shelf, and a door. The base will be 4 legs and 4 aprons to connect them, even though technically aprons weren't part of his drawing. Now, normally I wouldn't build these pieces nearly this thick, but I wanted to make sure that I had a lot of extra material there. That way I could thin things out and make a more dramatic wavy line in the end. After my pieces were dry, the next step was to use my planer to get everything to its final thickness. And from there I could rip my top, bottom, and sides to their final widths. Here I'm tilting my blade to 45 degrees, and that's so that I can cut a bevel onto each end of the case pieces. So I started by cutting one edge of each of the 4 pieces, and then I could measure and mark out my second cut and set the fence on my table saw to make sure that they were all consistently long. Once that was done, I did a dry assembly just to make sure that I was happy with all the corners and to make sure that the clamping would go smooth. And then I took it all apart, put on some glue, and clamped it back together for real. With the case dry, next I could get to work on my vertical partition. And to start, I needed to establish one corner with a perfect 90 cut on it. So here I'm clamping one of my Woodpeckers squares and using it as a guide for my circular saw. And while I was doing that, I went ahead and cut a straight edge onto my door panel as well. From there, I used my square to mark out exactly where I wanted the partition to sit, and then laid out a few more lines so that I could cut my panel to size. And I usually do that by making a few cuts to kind of sneak up on just the right size. And once I feel like I've got it, I go ahead and glue it in. Next, I could make my shelf, and this was pretty similar to making the vertical partition in terms of establishing a square corner and cutting it to size. The only unique thing was that I decided to make these little shelf supports out of some scrap from the bevel cuts that we made a minute ago. And those are for the shelf to rest on. And I'll say anytime that I can make use out of a piece of scrap for a project, I always feel like it's a sort of mini accomplishment. Because mostly what I end up using them for is a good old-fashioned game of Scrapsy Ball! Scrapsy Ball. And while I'm doing that, let me take a second to thank SimpliSafe for sponsoring this video. So SimpliSafe makes home security systems and provides services that make sure your home is safe. They protect like a pro thanks to a variety of factors. Things like having 24/7 professionally monitored systems, so in the event of a break-in, they receive highest priority police dispatch. And that's because their specialists can provide eyewitness evidence, which results in 3.5 times faster dispatches. Additionally, they cover the home comprehensively, inside and out, thanks to products like their video doorbell and cameras in unison with glass break sensors and everything else that they offer. And those are just a few of the reasons that SimpliSafe is the #1 expert recommended home security, and why over 3 million people rely on them daily. I've personally had my system for over a year now, and it's been fantastic. We started off with window and door sensors, glass break sensors, cameras, and the basics, and have since expanded to include things like the video doorbell, and most recently the SimpliSafe lock, which has been really cool. It does things like verify that our house is locked using a timer, and lets us keep track of who comes and goes, and even set unique codes for special circumstances. So if you've been thinking about getting a home security system, or even if you have a system that you think could be better, you owe it to yourself to give SimpliSafe a look. They have fair, honest prices with no hidden fees and no contracts, so you can opt out at any time, and setup is super simple to the point where you can do it quick and do it yourself. So put a system together and see if it's right for you. All right, thanks SimpliSafe. The next step was to install the door, and this is one of those steps where having the right tools and jigs really does make a world of difference. So to drill my holes in for the cups, I've been using this Kreg jig, which lets me perfectly place the cups and ensures that the pilot holes for the screws are parallel with the door's edge. And then to install the plate in the cabinet, I use this little template guide from Rockler, which again makes sure that the pilot holes are parallel and at the exact right depth. And these two things together make what could be kind of a frustrating job pretty simple. Okay, so now the cabinet's done other than the final shaping, and we could get to work on the base. So here I'm taking my legs over to the joiner and establishing one square corner. Then I can use that corner on my table saw top and fence to cut the pieces down to their finished width and thicknesses. Thickness? And after that was done, I could cut the legs to their finished lengths. For the aprons, again, I was able to use some of the off-cut scrap pieces that I had lying around. And to figure out their lengths, I just kind of set my legs on the cabinet and measured the gap between them. To assemble the base, I used dominoes between each apron and leg. And I had them kind of set back deep into the insides of the leg, which caused the dominoes to want to intersect. So I had to cut a few of them a little bit short to leave enough space for clearance. Next, I went ahead and attached the cabinet to the base using these figure 8 desktop fasteners, but you'll notice that the pieces aren't connected in some of the shots moving forward, and that's just because it was easier to move things and carve them without the pieces being attached at certain points. Okay, so with the drawing in hand, or a copy of it anyway, I grabbed a Sharpie and started laying out the general guideline for where I wanted to carve. And here I'm not trying to get a perfect match for the drawing or anything like that, but just kind of following along to the overall shape. And then once I decided that I was happy with it, I could start carving. Now, I haven't done a lot of this kind of carving in the past, but I will say that it is pretty fun. Kind of messy though. And it actually can go pretty quick if you get aggressive with it, so you really have to watch what you're doing. I always tried to kind of work my way to the line so that as I got close to it, I was removing material pretty lightly. Then once I felt that it was right, I would start removing material further back from the edge, more towards the center and backs of the panels. And on the top, I decided to only ever carve about halfway back into the panel and only in a few areas. And that's so that the majority of it would be left flat so that it would still be usable to set things on. But for the sides, I went ahead and carved all the way to the back of the panel. And that would help to leave a kind of cleaner, wobbly line when you viewed it from the front. So this is a technique that I can definitely see myself using more of, power carving followed by aggressive and then progressively finer sanding. And it's pretty surprising that it actually isn't that hard to get a really nice, flowy kind of curtain-like texturing. So it's definitely something that I want to play around with more on some normal pieces of furniture, maybe drawer fronts or something like that. Now, in my son's drawing, you can see that he made 4 really small doors. And I thought about a few ways that I could do this, but they were so small that I thought it made more sense to just leave them as one door and then just give it the illusion of being 4 separate doors. So again, here I started out by drawing the rough shape that I was going for, but then I got a router with a 1/8 inch square end bit and cut in fake gaps between the doors. From there, I routed out the handle or kind of door pull areas, and I made sure to leave a few high spots to mimic the way that he filled in those areas in his drawing, where the white of the paper is still showing through. After they were cut in, I got some leather dye and colored in all of the areas. Finally, the last thing to do was to go around the whole piece and add a dark line to the edges. And this was sort of a midway decision that I made because I thought that it would evoke the idea of a drawing a little bit more, and just kind of sell the idea of purposefully wrong that I had talked about in the beginning of the video.
Where did you get this?
Do you know what it is?
Yes.
What is it?
My drawing.
Yeah.
This is what I wanted you to do. I want you to cut off this piece and make it go and then also cut off this piece.
What do you mean cut them off?
Actually, it's okay.
It's okay?
Why did you put that?
Because that's what you drew. Here, let's go look at your drawing.
That was supposed to be a doorknob. It's not like a doorknob.
Special thanks to Michael Schmidt, Dave Yoakum, Frank Rath, Chris Rodriguez, Jim Dean, Jesse Hayes, Kyle O'Brien, Chukwuemeka Imenanjo, Andrew Woloshin, Aldo Mendoza, Rick Ratajczak, John Gorade, Luis Zaragoza, Skylar Ricketts, Dwayne, Tobias Krasberg, and the rest of my Patreon members for helping to make these videos possible. You've honestly made such a huge impact on my life and my ability to build projects like this, which would be kind of unfeasible otherwise. So thank you, seriously, for everything. And if you want to find out how you can support the show too, check out the link in the description and see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure.
That might be too small. That might be too small and it would block the doorway.
No.
Yeah.
You could just go like this.
Okay, we'll just slither into the living room always. What if we put it in the trash?
Comment down below and say boo to throwing it in the trash.
Boo!